Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and this is Fighting Anti-Semitism, the ISGAP Hour. That's ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And a year ago, I joined ISGAP because in looking around, I believed that of all the organizations I know, ISGAP is doing the most important, frontline, urgent work in fighting anti-Semitism tangibly and concretely and demonstrably. And that's why it's always a pleasure for me to begin this hour in conversation with the founding visionary and executive director of ISGAP, Dr. Charles Small. Hello again.
Hello, great to be with you. An honor to be with you, David.
And likewise, Charles, thank you. So since we last spoke, once again, it's both the same world and an entirely new world. And among the things that ISGAP has done has been appear in a briefing before the U.S. Congress, issue a very timely report on Students for Justice in Palestine, and lots more. So it's all yours, Charles.
So anyway, great to be here with you. And yeah, so on Tuesday,
May the 7th.
Right.
So
I was in Washington and I appeared at a briefing before the Oversight Committee. So it's a very important committee.
Of the House of Representatives.
Correct. In the Congress. And there were about 37 congressional leaders from both parties that were there. And because it was a briefing and there were no cameras in the room, I think people were really asking genuine questions. There wasn't any, playing to the camera as such. And there seemed to be, genuine...
And there were only two of you who were invited into that
Correct.
room from the outside, correct?
Right. One of my colleague was a professor of law from George Mason University. His name is David Bernstein. He's an expert in constitutional law. So he was fielding a lot of legal questions and looking at the implications of some of the potential breaking of laws in our university campuses and even in the classroom where professors and students are inciting to violence in some cases or discriminating against Jewish people.
And what was your role?
So I was the expert on issues of anti-Semitism. As you were saying, we just published a report on Students for Justice in Palestine. So there was a lot of interest in that. There was a lot of interest in the research that our team has been doing at ISGAP, looking at the Qatari funding or the Muslim Brotherhood funding of American universities. So there were a lot of questions along those lines.
And what were you able to convey in a nutshell? I mean, what were you hoping would be the takeaways that those members of Congress would remember an hour a day, a week later?
So I think I went there, I guess, with a sense of urgency. I think a lot of people in the Jewish community feel this urgency that things are getting a little bit out of control, that the temperature of anti-Semitic rhetoric and now even some physical actions against Jewish people is sort of becoming the new normal. A lot of the funding of American university, I think, have influenced the perception of Israel, Jews, and Zionism in the classroom. Professors are teaching, I think, about our collective history and culture and religion in a very pejorative way, and that's becoming kind of normal at an intellectual level, depicting Israel and Zionism as sort of white supremacy and colonialism and occupation, very horrible things at the intellectual level. And then the Students for Justice in Palestine, which is also connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. So Qatar is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, that they want to destroy Israel and even the United States. They're a small country of 350,000 people giving more money to American universities than any country in the planet. So that's happening at the intellectual level. At the student level, there's a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. They have over 250 chapters at universities across North America. And there's another group called Jewish Voices for Peace. It's an anti-Zionist, progressive in quotations.
Is it even demonstrably Jewish?
There are some Jewish members of it, but it's mixed. And what we found in our report is that the American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, is an organization that the same people who were in the Holy Land Foundation scandal set up AMP. So AMP is ideologically, politically, and financially connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're funding SJP. And in our report, this is the first time I think this has been established, we show that the Muslim Brotherhood through AMP is funding Jewish Voices for Peace. Now, these organizations have been saying that they are Hamas. They're not just supporting Palestinians in Gaza or calling for a ceasefire, but they're saying they're Hamas, that they're part of the struggle. And as we know, Hamas is an illegal terror organization.
It's designated a foreign terrorist organization in government language, FTO.
FTO, correct. So Hamas is being supported by Qatar. SJP is being funded by the Muslim Brotherhood. And these are the student groups on campus that have been making life miserable for Jewish students and faculty, and really turning the rhetoric on campus from some people calling for a ceasefire to really kind of naked, aggressive rhetoric and even physical behavior towards Jewish people, to blocking their path on campus, making, at Columbia, the Jewish faculty and students got to the point where they demanded going to classes online because they weren't safe to be in campus. And this is being repeated throughout the country. So I went to Congress really with the sense of, after 7 months of demonstrations and chanting, "We are Hamas," and demonizing Israel and the Jewish people, there's a radicalization process taking place. And we're in touch, our researchers are in touch with experts on extremism and counterterrorism. And I went to the Congress saying that this is really sort of heating up, and we're afraid of violence. We're afraid of young people who are a bit alienated, have been subjected to really radicalization. And if a young kid is feeling radicalized, alienated, wanting to be part of a group, has been chanting slogans for months, we're concerned that some people could use this moment to even engage in terrorism. So that was the impetus and urgency of our testimony.
So some JBS viewers may have seen this young student at Florida International University who made this declarative statement while reading a prepared text in which she said, I think I'm quoting her correctly, as Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, and anti-Jewish students, we deserve police protection. Was that a misstatement by her, do you think? Arab, I get it. Palestinian, I get it. Muslim, I get it in terms of identity. But anti-Jewish? Did she let out the secret? Did she misread the script? What happened?
I don't know what her level of intelligence is, but what we're beginning to see is more encouragement of violence. And there's also this mask of people who are claiming they're not anti-Semitic, they're just critical of Israel. But more and more the rhetoric is becoming anti-Jewish.
Right.
And what's also concerning is that they're leaving campus. In New York City and in other parts of the country, the protests are entering onto the streets. They're going into neighborhoods. They're going to the different museums, the fashion show. On the subway, they were chanting, kids with their identity covered in face masks and kafirs, chanting, we want to get rid of the Zionists, i.e. they want to get rid of the Jews. So they're entering into our communities, and they're not just focusing on criticizing Israel, but they're beginning to mention the Jewish people.
So let me personalize this for a moment, Charles. I have a son who went to an Ivy League institution and graduated in 2009. And during his years there, he kept saying to me, Dad, there's no problem here. Jews are absolutely safe. Israel is accepted and respected. And literally 15 years later, the son of a friend, actually of both of us, entered the same university and practically had to bring body armor with him as a Jew and a friend of Israel. So what I'm asking you is what we're seeing simply a spontaneous reaction to October the 7th, or is you're suggesting part of some much longer, much more thought through plan which is taking shape?
Well, that's the question. And actually today I was with some law enforcement people here in New York, and there was a group of us together, and we were saying on October the 8th, there were already protests in Times Square in New York City, and they had placards with the hang gliders that had entered Israel the day before, massacring people.
And to be clear, Israel had not responded.
Correct.
the events of October
Yeah.
7th on October the 8th.
Correct.
They were still reeling from it and figuring out next steps, correct?
Yeah, they were still pushing back the
But
the
you're
incursion.
suggesting the planning was there.
Well, that's what some of the law enforcement people are saying. That it's definitely coordinated, and I think as time goes on, we have radical Muslim extremists connected to Islamist ideology and philosophy and politics. We also have the radical left in the groups Antifa and other groups that were active in the Black Lives Matter protests have now entered into the campus. They're there on many campuses throughout the country. And in the last several weeks, we're beginning to see evidence of radical right-wing groups. So you have the radical right, the radical left, and political Islamists, very different groups, different ideologies, but all use anti-Semitism, genocidal anti-Semitism, as the fuel of these social movements. So it's a dangerous mix, if you will.
If I could just stick with the first two groups for a moment, Charles, because you're a scholar and you're a historian of the subject. What is it that attracts the progressive forces, as they call themselves, to perhaps the most regressive forces on the planet, extreme jihadists, who reject probably every value
Absolutely.
of the extreme left? And we know, for example, from the Russian Revolution of 1917, that those in charge are going to swallow not the far opposite, but the near, the Mensheviks, long before. So this group, before they go after the Sean Hannitys of the world on the right, aren't they going to try and swallow the so-called progressive left? And why is it that no one learns from history?
Yeah. And even I think I remember I've sort of been watching the protests in the last several weeks, and I'm reminded, and there's differences in this comparison, but I'm reminded of the revolution in Iran in the late 1970s, where progressive liberal students were upset with the Shah and were protesting against the Shah. The protests came from the universities, and slowly the radical Islamists entered into the universities and they sort of took over the student movement and ushered in this sort of radical Islamic revolution.
Which then targeted all of the reformist liberal students.
Secular.
Tortured, imprisoned, killed, or exiled.
Correct. Took away all rights of women,
So
minorities.
why does history have to keep repeating itself?
This is the question, yeah.
Does no one ever learn?
It's tragic, yeah. And what's also interesting, to respond to your question, we call this the Red-Green Alliance.
Right.
So universities are more liberal, of course, than the average, I think, population or political spectrum that exists in the country. And radical left-wing intellectuals are so irrational. People like Judith Butler, who's Jewish, who's gay, who's a leading intellectual.
She's at Berkeley, isn't she?
She's at Berkeley. She argues that Hamas and Hezbollah need to be understood as the progressive global left. After the massacre of October the 7th, she said it was difficult to watch, but that this was an act of resistance against the occupation and it's legitimate. It's absurd.
And as a gay person, she doesn't even forget the fact that she's Jewish. But as a gay person, she doesn't fear that she might be thrown off one of the buildings one day?
It's absurd. And where is the protest for women in Afghanistan, women in Iran, women in Gaza? What are their rights? They can't go to school. They can't go out unaccompanied by a male member of their family. It's absurd. So the radical left wants to do away with Western or American hegemony. They want to liberate all those who were once colonized. And the radical Islamists see the state, nation states as sort of the vestige of Western imperialism and colonialism, and they want to destroy the state.
And replace it with an Islamic caliphate,
correct,
for example.
Where Islamic rule, a very narrow version of Islamic rule, will rule the country and all relations. So it's absurd, it's irrational, but there is this Red-Green Alliance.
And the threat is real.
Yes.
Before we transition to our guests and JBS viewers, we have two very special guests coming up in just a moment. What's next on the ISGAP agenda? You've been exposing the Follow the Money project in Qatar. You spoke about it now. You've done this groundbreaking report on Students for Justice in Palestine. You've been briefing dozens and dozens of members of Congress. Clearly, ISGAP has had impact. Texas A&M, for example, has now announced it was going to end its relationship with Qatar, a direct result of ISGAP's work. What's next?
So in the next several weeks, we're going to have a report coming out on Columbia University, which will be interesting. There'll be another one on MIT and Yale. And we're also working on a report called The Project, which I think is fascinating. 40 years ago, the Swiss intelligence uncovered documentation by the Muslim Brotherhood outlining their strategic goals in the West. And they found that they wanted two things. They wanted to destroy Israel, and they wanted to destroy the United States of America. And in this document, in the strategic document, they outline how they're going to use anti-Semitism to remove Israel from the United States and alienate it, to destroy it, and to use anti-Semitism to fragment and weaken and destroy the United States. And these documents were found 40 years ago.
And they're authentic.
They're authentic, yes. We explain in the report where they come from and why they're authentic.
And Swiss intelligence itself confirmed that they're authentic.
Correct.
Okay.
And
so it's 40 years ago.
Right. So look where we are.
So what we're seeing today is not some spontaneous action of so-called do-gooders or
Correct.
Idealists.
Correct.
There's something way deeper behind it. There's a new Lenin in town.
Yeah.
And I don't mean John Lennon. I mean Vladimir Ilyich Lenin.
Yeah. So yeah, there's outside forces using soft power, using different leverages of influence to demonize the Jewish people in a way to fragment this country. And Professor Elie Wiesel, who's the founding president of ISGAP, always taught us that anti-Semitism may begin with the Jewish people, but it never ends with the Jewish people. And once this form of hatred is unleashed on society, it attacks human decency and democratic institutions. And we can see this being played out tragically as we speak.
And just to wrap up this segment, and to that point, it was just a few days ago that the demonstrators you spoke about, who were focusing on the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Fashion Gala, desecrated a World War I monument along Fifth Avenue to American soldiers who risked and gave their lives in defense of freedom in Europe. And not long ago at the University of North Carolina, a group of fraternity brothers stood up to defend the American flag.
Correct.
When the Palestinian flag was meant to replace the American flag. So the point of Elie Wiesel, your point, Charles, this is about Jews, yes. This is about Israel, yes. This is about much more as well. And all Americans, and not just Jews and JBS viewers, need to wake up to the new reality.
Absolutely.
And now, JBS viewers, it's our pleasure to introduce to you our two very special guests for today's program. The first is Professor Assaf Zeevi, who is a full professor and the holder of an endowed chair at Columbia University's School of Business, one of the finest business schools in the country, if not the world, and an expert in such topics as machine learning and artificial intelligence, both of which I promise you are not the principal topics of our discussion today, but maybe they'll help. And we're joined as well by Katie, who is a graduating senior at Columbia University, majored in psychology and won one of the important departmental prizes, and has been one of the loudest and proudest and most effective Jewish voices on Columbia University's turbulent campus since October the 7th, if not much longer. So Assaf and Katie, welcome to Fighting Anti-Semitism.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Let me open with a provocative question, if I may. If you were meeting with a group of high school juniors, since we're now in the spring of the year, and their parents, and they were to ask you as a faculty member and as a graduating student, would you recommend Columbia University for our young Jewish children or grandchildren for them to apply and consider matriculating, what would your answers be?
For me, it would be an unequivocal no. I think that Columbia's administration has proven time and time again, for really decades, but especially in the last 7 months, that they are not willing to protect Jewish students and that they are incapable at this point of doing so, considering the student body that they've admitted. So I would say that it is not a safe environment, and it's just not conducive to a positive educational experience. While Columbia's Jewish life is wonderful with both Chabad and Hillel, and there's a huge Jewish population there, which has certainly been my saving grace over the last 7 months, overall, I think the environment is dangerous, and I wouldn't recommend anybody who is Jewish to attend.
And Katie, if I heard you on a network interview maybe a few days or weeks ago, you were asked a question by the journalist, if you were a sophomore or a junior at Columbia, would you return in the fall for the next year, or would you consider transferring? I think I remember your answer, but JBS viewers may not.
Yeah, I would unequivocally transfer. The thought of coming back even this last semester was daunting enough, and finishing these last few weeks has been as well. I don't want to ever return to Columbia's campus, so if I was forced to go back for another year, if I wasn't graduating, I would unequivocally transfer.
So we're going to probe much more about what happened in Columbia, but I'm guessing that some of the parents and grandparents want the other part of the answer, which is, where would you go? Where should our children go? Any thoughts on that one?
I would implore people who are looking into it to look at schools that have handled this in a much better manner. University of Florida, right, had said day one of the encampment, this is not a daycare. If you act like children, you will be treated as children, and this problem will not be allowed on our campus. University of Texas, Austin, I know how to appropriate response as well. But I would steer clear of schools like UCLA, Columbia, Harvard that have shown that they're not interested in protecting Jewish students.
And I think, by the way, Brandeis University, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm a trustee of Brandeis University, but Brandeis University extended its transfer application date in order to accommodate students who may not feel comfortable wherever. It was not specifically Columbia, but any of the schools where they may not feel comfortable. So perhaps we should add Brandeis to that list. But again,
absolutely.
Assaf, you're a faculty member. How long have you been to Columbia?
Over 20 years.
Over 20 years. So my original question, but also I wonder, because Katie came out of the starting gates very clearly. How do you react and respond to that? I mean, you've given 2 decades of your life to this university. Does it sound harsh?
I think what Katie experienced and other of her peers experience is something which I think completely justifies her response. So I can identify with that, although I haven't experienced that myself because I'm a faculty, I'm in a different area, I'm in a slightly different part of campus, but I completely understand where she's coming from, and I think it's a well-justified point. My message to parents and kids who are about to apply, but more so to the parents, is you have to look at what's going on in universities. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not, and you have to ask a serious question. Am I sending my kid to get a real education there, or am I sending them to get brainwashed and believe in all sorts of nonsense? I think that is a question on the table. I would say send them to these institutions if they show a real willingness to engage with our problems and do a significant reform. The way they're working right now, I think the failure points have been exhibited pretty clearly.
So if I may, Assaf, you say brainwash, which is a very heavy statement in a space of a liberal education, which is supposed to be the exact opposite, where we're supposed to train young people to think critically. When you say brainwash, what do you mean? Like what's going on with the curriculum? Why would you say that?
Yeah, so I chose that term quite carefully. I know it's a strong term, but I've chosen it quite carefully. The effect of this type of process that I call brainwashing, of course it depends on the individual and how they respond to curriculum, role models of sorts, peers, etc. So there's a high variance in terms of what amounts to brainwashing, but where I think the university has been very negligent is basically in recognizing again what is the academic mission of the institution. It's knowledge inquiry. All this discussion of free speech, First Amendment, and so on, it's very nice, but it's a tool, it's a vehicle towards achieving a goal. The goal of the university is to do that type of exploration and endow the students with tools to evaluate the world, to be critical. I don't see a lot of evidence of that when you look at the representatives of this movement on the Columbia campus, including Barnard. I think evidence of brainwashing to me, even if I knew nothing about the curriculum, and I'll touch upon that in a second, even if I knew nothing about that, the evidence is basically in the data. You see the way that they express themselves, how they react to questions. I don't think you need to be a genius to understand that this person has been trained to view the world as completely flattened and in a black and white simplistic narrative that's easy to parrot in these events. So I don't think you need a lot more data. But if you're asking about courses and curriculum, there is ample evidence of curriculum that's been altered over the past, I would say, I'm guessing like 10, 15, maybe 20 years, with a shift towards more radicalized content, including, I know this is sort of a shocker for most Americans that grew up in the US, Marxist ideas, and these things are placed in a variety of locations across the curriculum, which are completely leaving them as a fifth wheel. Like, why would somebody in public health need to learn about an oppressed oppressor framework or things of that sort? And this, again, is infiltrated almost every part of the curriculum. I'm not sure if Katie can comment on this, but I've heard firsthand about students who take courses in writing, and the choice topics are, again, about oppressed oppressor frameworks, intersectionalism, and so on. Some of these are valid topics, but they're not the main purpose of a course like that. So once you start diverting courses in that direction, it's becoming really a platform for an ideology and promoting an ideology. That's not what the university should be doing. The university, again, as I said, it's a place where young people are supposed to open their minds, not close their minds to other options.
Thank you, Assaf. And Katie, I wanted to ask you, on October 7th, when everything erupted, were you at all surprised by what you witnessed at Columbia? After all, you were not a freshman. You were a senior. You had already been there 3 years. So you had a sense of the zeitgeist of what was going on there. Could you have foreseen this, or did it catch you by surprise?
I think it was not shocking. As Assaf has said, there was a lot of, kind of brainwashing and these Marxist ideals that have been pushed to this idea of oppressed versus oppressor. There is a strong desire to be victims amongst these people and these students. And so I think that...
Did you experience that in the classroom yourself?
Yes, unequivocally. I've been in classes where students have said that they are Marxists.
How about faculty?
I've been in classes, and I'm not where faculty have explicitly said that, but where faculty have insinuated that and have certainly said that they are socialists or liberals or
anti-Zionists?
Personally, I've not been in a class where Zionism has really been brought up in that context. I have been around students who have said anti-Zionist things, but I know that there are professors like Joseph Mossad at Columbia who are extremely anti-Semitic and who said things like the October 7th attacks were awesome and amazing. And Professor Abdu, who was apparently fired according to our
according to the testimony of the president.
Except for he was in the encampment all 3 weeks.
And he still has his office there. So.
And he still has his
and
office
he was
there.
teaching in the encampment.
Yes, and he was continuing to promote these terrorist ideals.
And you're a student of psychology. I understand that you're at the beginning of your career, but how do you explain this kind of this anomalous relationship between, and we were talking about it earlier in the show, Charles, between what I would say are the most regressive forces on the planet, Islamic jihadists who reject every progressive value that I'm aware of, on the one hand, and all the self-described progressives on the other hand, who have romanticized and glorified this regressive movement. Strange marriage, isn't it?
It's extremely strange, and I've discussed
You're a psychology student. Help us understand.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I have had conversations that have ended with, we live in different realities, and I think that sometimes that's what it comes down to. But overall, I think there is this extreme need to be a victim. There is very much the oppressor and the oppressed, and being a victim or being socially ostracized is now cool. And these people seem to unfortunately not have a lot else going on in their lives, which is, sad for them, but they have seemingly found a community almost of people who are willing to hang out with them, that they can promote these kind of ideals that, as you say, go against everything they stand for, but they don't care. They don't hear that. because it doesn't
So
fit
even if
this
they're
agenda.
gay, they're proudly, openly gay, they're not at all concerned that if these jihadists ever took power, whether Colombia or a country, they might be thrown off rooftops.
It doesn't get to that point in their brains.
It doesn't.
We-
Or women, wondering about, on the one hand, their freedom and liberation, on the other hand, their repression and suppression.
Yeah, it's completely illogical. I've had discussions with many students in attempting to peacefully converse, in which I've said, you're holding up a sign that says lesbians for liberation or queers for Palestine. Do you understand that who you're supporting is fundamentally against what you strongly believe in? Oh, that's not true. That's not true. October 7th, nobody was raped. That didn't happen. There's just a complete denial of facts and
you have your
logic.
truth, I have my truth, and the twain shall not meet.
Which is
And
relativism.
Yes, and if the truth doesn't fit the narrative of the oppressor versus oppressed, it's no longer the truth in their minds.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I had a discussion with an outside protester who came on campus on October 8th or 9th, and he was holding a sign about Israeli and U.S. oppression, and I went up to him very peacefully and calmly and said, excuse me, I'm Jewish, I'm just curious, what exactly are you speaking about? What is this oppression that you're referring to? And he essentially went on a rant to me, which ended with this entire thing, including speaking to October 7th, was the U.S.'s fault because we wrongfully killed Osama bin Laden. And these are the same people who are standing outside of our campus every day or multiple times a week with signs supporting Marxism, supporting socialism, saying that we need to essentially overthrow the U.S. and Israeli governments to promote this agenda that they have, and it's completely beyond logic.
And Assaf, some people think that the universities are really in a way segmented, that the business school, for example, or maybe the medical school or the STEM field is different than the social sciences and humanities. How's it playing out at Columbia from your perspective at the business school?
I mean, I think broadly speaking, there is some truth to that theory. That is, you see some demarcation between the STEM areas, professional schools, and so on, where students also come in with a clear objective. They're looking to improve career options, etc. They don't really have time for this or attention span. They're also a little bit older, so they've seen a bit more. There are a lot of factors that are included in that. And there's also a selection bias. Whoever goes to study physics and math is different than somebody who goes to study anthropology. But a good counterexample to that theory, you don't need to look far, look up 95 in Boston at the MIT campus. They've had severe issues there with their own encampment and the way that their administration is handling it. And those are people who are there to study STEM, engineering, computer science, and so on. We're not really seeing different narratives there or greater openness to engage, etc., which shows again that this is a more fundamental phenomena. That was my response to your earlier question, that if you would give advice to people now, I would urge not just people who are Jewish, but Americans in general to look at this with a great degree of concern for the future, that this is something that could really jeopardize the institutions in the U.S. that have lasted a very long time and have withstood a lot of seismic shocks along the way and have proven quite durable. But I really think this is something, the universities are a weak spot. If you take over universities and start really propagating these agendas, you're putting greater society at risk too. And you touched upon this, the fact that kids who are 19, 20 can romanticize movements who've chartered, complete destruction, annihilation, murder, rape, etc. It completely doesn't go hand in hand with liberal view of the world. But somehow for these kids, there's no contradiction. And maybe, as Katie said, they don't let the facts confuse them. But the narrative, which she also said, that's the important thing. That's where the university can step in. There shouldn't be this training across the curriculum to basically impress this narrative upon the students, who are, again, young and impressionable. Mm-hmm. And faculty should promote critical thinking, not to say the world operates in this way and everything else is basically just a false narrative. They should encourage the students to ask tough questions. And if somebody presents you with a narrative, try to poke holes in it, for example. What we're seeing is the exact opposite. They're sheltering within this narrative and finding, their own little community, but it doesn't have a lot of relationship to the real world. And I'll just say one more thing. Why do I think parents should be concerned? Well, first of all, you're sending the thing that's most dear to you, right? Your kids. You want them to build this open mind, to become better people along the way. The fact is, not only are you getting this brainwashing, but you're emerging from these 4 years ill-equipped to deal with the real world. From all these safe spaces in the university, all this sort of touchy-feely sense that you can say anything and everything's okay and every answer is correct and incorrect at the same time. This isn't the way the world actually works. And the university is really failing on that educational mission if it continues to go in the same path.
A quick question. From both of your perspectives, you think that the leadership of the university is dealing with this brainwashing, the curriculum issues, the safety of students? Do you think that the administration is stepping up? Because from the outside looking in, it seems that the testimony of the president of Columbia University, there's a lot of contradictions between the reality of Columbia and what she was saying in Washington. Do you think that there is the pressure still on them to change things, or is it going to be the same old thing in September?
I think it's a complex question. I think to the credit of this administration, this is their first year. And so this brainwashing that's been going on for years is not to their fault yet. Is it being perpetuated under their administration? Unequivocally, yes. But I would be a little bit more reluctant to blame them for that at this point. For protecting Jewish and frankly just American students who are just trying to go to class. They are unequivocally responsible. They have been warned by the Jewish faculty and students for 7 months that this was happening, that it was getting worse. We urged them to stop it on October 8th. We urged them to stop it on October 9th, and we've been urging them to stop it every single day since, and they have continued to choose not to. And for that, they're unequivocally liable.
You think that will change in September?
I don't see it changing. Personally, I was cautiously optimistic after the first day of arrests in the encampment, but then we saw what happened for the next 2 weeks. So I think there's a ton of pressure on the administration right now, both from Congress, which I'm very grateful for, but also from 4 different legal actions that have been taken against them thus far, and I'm sure many more to come after these last few weeks. They've already had to cancel their major commencement ceremony. I don't know how much more pressure we can put on them, and if all of these things have not yet changed their actions, I'm not exactly sure what would.
I think when you're asking to examine the university, it's also important to understand, and this is to the broader viewership, what exactly is a university? I can say something about the university, but I'm actually part of it, right? So I'm also criticizing myself along the way. So the university is a very complicated body, which is made up of lots of moving parts. To simplify it a little bit, there may be like a triangle with 3 vertices: the students, the faculty, and the administration. And then above that, there are the board that basically oversees all of this. As you mentioned, you yourself serve on a board, so that has an important duty as well. Start off with asking basic questions about these 3 vertices. Are we admitting the right students? Maybe these students, a lot of them over the past 10 years, we've shifted to admitting students who are predisposed to be social activists as opposed to coming to university and expanding their knowledge and really pursuing this concept of knowledge inquiry through critical thinking, discourse, etc. So are we admitting the right input? Faculty. Are the faculty basically working with the institution or against the institution? If you're spending your time in class brainwashing students with these ideas in courses that have nothing to do with that, in what should be a nominal curriculum, you're promoting this issue. You're not being a good citizen of the university. You're causing damage to the students and to the institution. There has to be some accountability. I mean, if there's no accountability on that end, you're not going to make progress. And then the third verdict is the administration itself. To give them a little bit of slack, what hit them after October 7th, I think, is, as Katie said, it's a culmination of many years in the making. I hate to use the term because politicians have exploited it, the rot. The rot is pretty deep. Like, you have to really do a massive overhaul here to address all the issues. You can't do that within a span of a few months under so much duress. But so much for slack. I mean, they're ill-equipped to deal with it. I'm pretty sure that when they were looking on the job description for the president of Colombia, they weren't looking at the type of things that she has to deal with now. But again, I want to stop the slack and say that now comes a time for action. They have to face the problems, admit them, and engage in reform. If they don't do that, then I think there's no more slack to cut. And I think the basic things that you see now unraveling, the lawsuits, Title VI, et cetera, it just shows you the degree of confusion. People think that the First Amendment rights gives you a right to say pretty much anything, not understanding that a lot of the students are supported by federal money, which basically dictates that you can't create a hostile and discriminatory environment. Mm-hmm. Even make that clear. I mean, we do trainings on Title IX today in the university, sexual harassment. I think we're now at a phase where it's pretty clear we have to train people about what free speech really is in the confines of an institution that's receiving federal support. Not to mention, it's morally bankrupt to create that type of environment. But even just for the pure technical reason of the federal support, the lawsuits are predicated on that, purely on that aspect.
So that's a perfect opportunity for me to reframe Charles's question in a way. Is it your sense, and I understand that you may be outsiders looking in when it comes to the administration and the decision makers, but for them, is it your guesstimate that this is still about a strategic communications issue? That they somehow have to find the right messaging from the right crisis management firms and advertising firms to restore Colombia's reputation? Or do you have a sense that this is going into a much deeper dive where they've grasped, as Charles has said and both of you have said, that there's something much deeper and more worrisome going on here about the very nature of a university and a liberal education? What's your sense? Is it the former or the latter?
I think, if I may go first, I think it's really the bigger issues. And I know Charles has spoken a bit about also outside influence on the universities, et cetera, so I don't want to rehash that point, but there's that as well. I think from the standpoint of the very important tasks and the role the universities play in the U.S., and they've played an incredibly important role over the years, and they still play that role. It's one of the reasons the U.S. is what it is. It's an incredibly important but very fragile mission that you have to be aware of now, all these cracks that are appearing there. I think if you're the CEO and you behead the chief marketing officer in the firm because the product isn't selling, maybe the marketing job isn't well done, but maybe the product isn't the right product. So maybe look back, introspect, and examine the product. When I was discussing that triangle and the whole process, this is what you need to examine. You need to take a really careful look at that. That's the product.
But what I'm asking, I guess, in a way, Assaf, and I don't know that you know the answer, is you're suggesting what should be done, and I'm asking what is being done.
What is being done is extremely...
Is the product being examined, do you think?
No. I think the response has been extremely superficial. I'll pass it to Katie in a second. And it's in the culture where you think that the veneer really can take you the whole 9 yards.
Right.
And the answer is no. And if you think the problems are going to go away in September, they're not. And even if there's no encampment in September, the fundamental problems still exist. Maybe nothing will bring them to the surface, as we've seen now, but they exist. It's an opportunity to really do a major overhaul here to address these issues.
What do you think, Katie?
Yeah, I agree. I think a major overhaul is 100% necessary. If you look at the student body...
But it's not under consideration, you don't think, right now?
I don't think it's under consideration.
It's still viewed much more as a marketing issue. How do we restore the luster of Colombia?
I don't even think we're at that point yet, to be honest with you. I think Colombia's administration is in way over their heads. They are unqualified for the positions that they're in, frankly. And I think that they have kind of essentially gone into crisis mode of let me grasp at straws to see what works, like negotiating with people who are promoting terrorist ideals. How is that allowed, right? It doesn't make sense. Governments don't negotiate with terrorists. Why should Colombia negotiate with terrorists?
But isn't this the problem? How do you kind of reshape the product? Because in the university there's tenure, and it's a sacred part of a university system. And there are professors at Columbia
Don't get
University.
nervous, Assaf.
I have tenure. I'm not nervous.
No, I know. He's revolutionizing tenure.
Yeah. No, but there are professors at Columbia University, obviously, with tenure, and I would argue that anti-Semitism in academia, Columbia University was a pioneer. They had people like Edward Said, Rashid Khalidi, Joseph Mossad, and many others, really, I think, created this sort of anti-Semitic discourse that is normalized and a very important discourse in academia throughout the world, that Israel is an apartheid racist state, and from a liberal human rights perspective, if Israel is a settler colonial racist entity, it would have to be dismantled. I attended a workshop at the social work school in November at Columbia University, and there were professors of gender studies, some of the most brilliant doctoral students, right? These are people that have mastered the discourse. And they were arguing that the occupation has to be resisted by all means necessary, and they use philosophy and social science and cultural studies, and brilliant. They make the argument that the resistance is ethically required and by any means necessary. What happened on October the 7th was a response, an ethical response to the occupation. The murder, the sexual abuse was justified because the Jews were on the land and they invited the violence upon themselves. These were professors and doctoral students arguing brilliantly. This was not only a call for the elimination of the State of Israel, this was a very sophisticated, intellectual call for the murder of Jewish people. This is professors, this is in the classroom, and the classroom is informing the students. The classroom is informing and working with the students in SJP and JVP to make lives miserable for Jewish students and faculty physically. But the intellectual rot is there. And these people have tenure and they've been tolerated. We knew 40 years ago, 20 years ago that these appointments were going to cause devastation. So how do you reform this mess when these people have tenure? And the discourse today is an essential part of scholarship, not only at Columbia, but around the Western world. How do you decenter this?
I think that question is 5 orders over my pay grade, and we could probably spend an hour discussing whatever ideas I do have on that reform. But I think the only thing I can say is there is a mayday call for the reform. Fortunately, I think maybe it's not too late to do the reform, and we've received our wake-up call. When you see students that interpret by all means necessary as a violent takeover of a building, of harassing university staff inside the building and threatening them. You saw what the police found inside that building after they raided it. That's not the stuff that students
Can you
basically...
tell our viewers, what did they find?
Box cutters, manuals explaining terrorism 101, gas masks, not the typical things you find in the the backpack of a student going to class. Like the only thing missing was laptops, notes, pencils, but outside of that they found everything necessary for a student. So the students
they didn't find space in their backpacks for water, so they made appeals to the world for humanitarian assistance,
right,
lest they suffer from dehydration.
Yeah, from the building that has a water fountain on every one of the 7 floors.
Right, but that's your truth.
Exactly.
Well, it shows you, again, when I said very early on that you can sense the brainwashing without even getting into the curriculum, this is exactly it. I mean, if a student, a doctoral student on top of everything, stands outside that building in the wee hours after the conquest of the building and, whining for humanitarian aid in a building that has water fountains in it, it's because they feel compelled to play the part. In their Revolutionaries 101 course, you need apparel, keffiyehs, you need common cause, you need an enemy. They found also a common enemy to galvanize the forces. You could check the boxes, this is basically revolutionary training 101. They've executed that plan. I think this is the wake-up call. If students are willing to interpret by any means necessary as doing that, I don't want to see what would have been the next step if they wouldn't have called in the police at that point. And they're literally putting themselves at risk and other students at risk, but the cause is beyond anything at this point. It's hard to really think about that as the core of a liberal value system, right? I mean, this is a thing that parents should really be thinking about. This is how we're training. At least some of the kids have shown that they're susceptible to these ideas and are willing to push them pretty far. I think that is the wake-up call. The university can't really afford that these things will happen on campus in a bastion of discourse and, again, knowledge inquiry and so on. This cannot happen. But will they really treat it as a wake-up call? I think the work that's involved is so significant. It goes outside the tenure of any single president. I think, therefore, the planning isn't really very long-term. Right now, it's survival mode. I don't know after survival mode is passed what the next thing is, but it's a lot of things to undertake. And again, it's a topic that we can engage in much more length. It's beyond the scope of time.
And unfortunately, we don't have that much more length. But in the meantime, Katie, from the perspective of the students that you know, both those who think like you and others that you've come to know over the years, you had the president of the university who was very hesitant to act, may have been in over her head. It wasn't part of her job description when she got the job, or at least so she thought, but then did call in the NYPD. And people from outside often applauded. But then after that, she seemed to have once again hesitated. Does she have the appearance of waffling? And how do students view that?
Oh, unequivocally, she has the appearance of waffling. Nobody respects her, unfortunately.
When you say no one, you mean students?
I think students and I think a lot of faculty don't respect her either. She's said, you have to be out by 2 p.m. or else. Well, then it's 2 p.m. the next day, nothing's happened. Okay, now really 4 p.m. It was just so absurd. We'll sit down and negotiate with you. We'll talk about divesting from Israel, whatever that means, because these students would have to give up their iPhones if they wanted to divest from Israel, right? They're more interested in painting their nails for Palestine and having yoga sessions in their tents with their friends. But it can't be, you can't be in charge and not show any leadership skills, unfortunately. And that's what's happened. There's been a complete lack of moral clarity. But more than that, it is 1,000% in a job description of a president to be a leader. She has not been a leader. She has not shown any type of respectable quality when it comes to this in terms of I say no, no means no. And she's appeasing terrorists, and she let the prisoners run the asylum is what it really came down to.
Have you as a student leader on campus had the opportunity to meet with her since October 7th?
I've not. I haven't seen her around at all. I think she's very much kept kind of to herself and to avoid what's going on campus and avoid acknowledging it.
But you've been one of the more outspoken students. Has anyone in the administration sort of looked for you and sat you down and wanted to hear from you and your thoughts and your suggestions quietly?
I've spoken once or twice with one of the deans who was, very receptive, but unfortunately nothing came from the conversation. But beyond that, no. I send emails multiple times a week informing them of what's going on. I've been told that they're having trouble identifying people, so I sent them a 20-page document of people's faces, never got a response. And so there's really a lack of interest, but also just a lack of backbone. They're trying to appease both sides. Had they, on October 7th or 8th, said what happened in Israel is horrible, anti-Semitism and pro-terror rhetoric are strictly prohibited on our campus. If you participate in these activities, you will be suspended and or expelled. And they had stuck with that, this would never have gotten to this point. It wouldn't have been able to get to this point because those students wouldn't be there anymore. And instead, you have students like Kaimani James, who said online that all Zionists deserve to die and we should all be grateful he hasn't murdered us yet. He said that in he was live recording a Zoom meeting he had with administration after being investigated for saying that he fights to kill and Zionists should be careful. His administration knew about this, and the only reason that he ever got a consequence for it was because the live stream went viral after this encampment happened, but otherwise they were letting this individual run around.
Did the administrators get reprimanded for allowing this to take place, and they did nothing with him? It's astounding.
Nothing's happened as far as I know, yet. I know really appreciate Congress looking into this, but the fact that the U.S. government has to step in at a university that should be able to be controlled by its own leadership, it's one of the premier universities in the world. Why can't they find a president who has leadership skills?
Assaf, in a way, the same question. Has the administration reached out to you? There's also now a new anti-Semitism task force, or maybe not so new any longer. Does that offer any hope for the university? Are you consulted in those conversations?
I'm not
and
part of
we're wrapping up, so unfortunately we're going to have to sort of just ask for headlines.
Yeah, I'm not part of the task force, but I think they're really good people there, and I think they've made a lot of progress in a variety of areas. I think with regard to the leadership of the university, I've met with all the senior leadership. It's hard for me to say that had a lot of impact. I think, again, part of it is because they're in crisis mode. But to Katie's point, there is no such thing as a vacuum. If there's a leadership vacuum, it's going to get filled. Unfortunately, here it's filled by the occupants of the asylum, but also faculty. Faculty have filled that void and have basically egged on the students. I think part of the issue is that the students can actually suffer repercussions. They're going to go and spend a night in detention. They may get expelled, suspended, or whatnot. The faculty can keep on with their lives. So this is part of a leadership vacuum. Like, if the faculty feel that they can do those things, then it's part of their job description. It means that there isn't a responsible adult in the room that can hold them in check.
We're just about out of time, but Katie, I want to give you sort of a last chance. Sum it all up for our viewers. What do you want them to remember from this conversation and your experience at Columbia?
I think the important thing to note and to share with all of our friends, Jewish and not Jewish, is that this goes beyond Columbia. This goes beyond even anti-Semitism. This is anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, anti-American, and pro-terrorist. These people want a takeover of the West. They support terrorism, they support rape and murder and butchering of innocent civilians, and that should not be tolerated in any civilized society. And the fact of the matter is that the administration at Columbia and at all these universities, and frankly of the world, needs to gain moral clarity, gain leadership skills, or they need to find new jobs. And it's our role and responsibility, I believe, as the Jewish people, to speak out on behalf of this and to ensure that the world knows this is not just about us. This is about everybody, and it is our role as citizens and believers in the free world to make it clear that this is pro-terrorism and that we cannot stand for this, and nobody can stand for this in our society.
Very well said, Katie.
Excellent.
Final thought?
I think if the American public watches the students rally in favor of the Houthis turning ships around in the Bay, and they follow the tweets by the Iranian supreme leader supporting the demonstrations, you have the story. This is anti-American. I think it's a big wake-up call. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not. You have to really be worried here that this is not a fight of just the Jewish students on Columbia campus.
And with that, Katie, thank you so much. And you're not going to have a college graduation at Columbia. You didn't have a high school graduation because of COVID. I'm sorry on both counts. We wish you lots of success when you leave Columbia.
Thank you.
Assaf, you're not leaving Columbia anytime soon, I suspect. So we wish lots of success for those of you hoping to restore the purpose and mission of Columbia. JBS viewers, you've just heard from Professor Assaf Zeevi, professor at Columbia University School of Business, and from Katie, a graduating senior at Columbia University. It's not that I don't know her last name, but she preferred that we not use it. To understand why the work of ISGAP is so important on campuses and across the country and around the world today, I think all you have to do is reflect on this last hour of our being together. On behalf of Dr. Charles Small and myself, this is the ISGAP Hour, Fighting Anti-Semitism. See you next time.